just a little bit about Shane and Emily. Emily is a teacher at the SF Boys Choir and
also the
opera.
San Francisco Opera.
Yeah. And Shane works at a place called Arup, and he's a acoustic.
Architectural acoustics consultant.
There we go. Architectural.
I design spaces like this. Not this one, unfortunately.
So we had a lot of people from his company come actually when we did the reception a couple weeks ago, and that was really nice too to get some interesting feedback. So anyway, please help me welcome Shane and Emily and enjoy the talk.
All right, thanks everyone. Oh, there we go. So yeah, thanks to Nicole for the introduction, and thanks for coming. And
Yes.
Like Nicole mentioned, this is a kind of a redo of the closing reception that we had, just a little explanation of this piece that we call Fathom Self-Assembling Music. So to kind of start off, I thought we'd talk a little bit about this space and why it's exciting from the perspective of a composer. So as Nicole was mentioning, you have this really fancy sound system in here, which involves dozens of loudspeakers kind of populated throughout the space. You can see all those circles on the mezzanine ceiling and stuff are loudspeakers. There are a bunch up in the technical grid and all around the space. So in kind of normal mode, this room is meant to be able to create different room acoustics. So there's an array of microphones above the stage, and you can pick something up on the stage and create a different ambience in the space, which is really exciting. So that's great from kind of an architectural and usage perspective, but from a compositional perspective, you can actually bypass that aspect of the system and directly address the loudspeakers themselves. So what you have then is kind of a spatial sound canvas in this room. So traditionally with composition, you have aspects of music such as like timbre, melody, harmony, and time. And then in this space, you also have this additional element of architectural space. So being able to place and move the sounds around within the room. So to give you some context for why that would be exciting and why that's not that far a leap for a traditional composer, Emily's going to talk a little bit here. Just kidding.
Maybe. So it might seem a little bit strange to talk about the spatial aspects of a musical composition as being an unusual thing for a composer to play with, because whenever we're listening to music, there is some spatial aspect. For a really, really long time in human history, in fact, in order to experience music, you actually had to just go into a space and experience people playing it live and all of the acoustical implications of the space you're in. I have two pictures up here that I really like. They're both from the same place, the Piazza San Marco and the Cathedral San Marco. And one of the things that was often done in these big plazas was gigantic parades of wind ensembles that would march around the square, which if you've ever been to a parade, you've had a very weird and exciting immersive spatial audio experience as it walks past you. But also, just from the point of view of a traditional sort of Western compositional perspective, composers have been playing with the idea of placing sounds in unusual places for a really long time. In the Cathedral San Marco, a composer named Gabriele really famously would split his ensembles into all of these smaller brass choirs and vocal choirs and put them up in different choir lofts and balconies so that there would be this surprising element during a church service of the music suddenly coming from behind you and then suddenly coming from in front of you and echoing back and forth. The trouble with that is if you suddenly want that wind ensemble to be someplace else, you can't just move them easily. They're sort of stationed where they are. Whereas in a space like this, we can make use again of that architectural space, but suddenly you can move things in this really exciting way, which is different than we usually listen to music now. It's a different way of listening, because since recorded music has become the norm, what you end up with is this sort of fictional localized sonic space instead of a naturally spatial acoustic.
Yeah, so with recording technology and various sound reinforcement technologies, you can create any space that you want. So you're not tied to the very space that you're in or the kind of arrangement of the ensemble like Emily was mentioning. But you are tied to a specific location, and you can have kind of a 5.1 thing, but it's still a static experience. And oftentimes there's actually many, many natural acoustic spaces on a recording that are superimposed on one another. So that's why we call it kind of a fictional space. But with these immersive spatial audio technologies, and the forum's one example. There are some other examples in the Bay Area. That's at Stanford, their listening room at Stanford. And I have to give a shout out, this is where I work. This is the Arup Sound Lab. So both of these are ambisonic spaces, which aim to recreate a sound field. So you can define a sound field mathematically and actually recreate it over a very specific arrangement of loudspeakers. The forum's different from that, but it still has that sense of being able to place the sound anywhere you like in the theater. So the work that Emily and I most often work together, and a lot of the work we've done over the past few years has involved some sort of interaction. I mean, just essentially based on the accessibility of physical computing and all the different types of sensors you can put anywhere and do anything with these days. We've added a lot of that into our work over the past couple of years. And so as we were developing this proposal, particularly because it was for the Exploratorium, we wanted to use this spatial sound canvas in some interactive way.
Now that brings up a couple of different things that are always a challenge for anyone, but particularly for us as composers. First, I think Shane is going to be able to show you a little bit of just the practical hands-on aspect of like what we did to build these podiums here so that
I was going to do that after.
Oh,
yeah.
Never mind then. So besides the practical aspect, which Shane will show you the inside guts of one of these things in a few minutes, there's also the compositional challenge of writing a piece of music that's interactive, but that still makes any sort of sense as a composition. So my background is primarily in really traditional Western compositional techniques. So that means people walk into a space, they sit down, there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, maybe there's some stuff that's left to chance in the middle, but for the most part, the performance begins, ends, and then people have had that experience. Whereas in a piece like this, we couldn't design with that in mind. People might come in and listen for 30 seconds. They might walk in and stay for 2 hours. The people who are interacting with it are going to change what sounds they're hearing and where they're going to be, what frequency, what speed at which they're moving around the room. So we had to design a piece of music that had some sort of structural integrity that would allow it to be itself and to work well no matter who was in here, who was listening to it, and how long they stayed. So in order to do that, we couldn't come up with just a standard narrative. Beginning, middle, end wasn't going to work. So we were looking to physical and scientific structural systems. Things like we were, toying with ideas of chemistry and of gravitational physics and all sorts of things that we thought, maybe there's like a thing in there that we can use as a metaphor that we're working with. And then Shane came home with the idea of self-assembly, which...
Yeah, so the kind of going through the assemblies of like a carbon-14 atom were like exciting scientifically, but compositionally they're very rigorous, right? So it's difficult to devise a kind of experimental interactive composition around any of those philosophies or those rules of science. So we happened upon this. I was actually at the Autodesk Gallery down on One Market, and they have all these cool like things they've designed with 3D printers and that sort of thing. And they had these jars, which is from the MIT Self-Assembly Lab. So I thought, well, that's cool because you can shake these jars and then they form this structure that's like an intended structure based on the geometry. But then I didn't actually know what the concept of self-assembly was. So this is a kind of a loose category in science, which takes a group of objects which have a very specific geometry or something about their makeup that gives them valence, the kind of ability to attract. And then the second thing the system needs is some force of energy to make them attract. So this is a pretty cool video using ferrofluids to show the principle here. So you have your droplets of the ferrofluids here. And you have this very slippery surface and then a magnet below. And so they're assembled as themselves, and as you add the energy force, they assemble into a new structure. And then when it stops, they go back to what they were. And I'll let you watch another one just because this video is really cool. So you have this initial static state, and then as you have the dynamic state, it forms into a new structure.
So what was kind of interesting for us about this concept was, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute too, is that we have these sounds that we've designed that are the sort of initial state, and then we could use the people walking in and interacting with it as the energy being applied to it to help it to create these larger structures or different structures.
And so you saw there as it kind of goes through, goes through the different types of energy forces, it forms different things. It doesn't only form the 3 bars or the 6 or 7 disordered components, but it has various states of assembly, which was exciting. So, and then this MIT self-assembly lab actually takes this and extrapolates it to the kind of like architectural futurism. So what I mean by that is they posit that in thousands of years or something, we could theoretically form some basis of architecture in which the building components themselves have these geometries, and then we adapt some force that would assemble the buildings. Right now they're more at rocks in a jar, but hopefully they get there in a couple thousand years. So in any event, this was an exciting kind of basis for the composition. So what we did was we decided to take 6 sounds, and I'll play each of these sounds in a second. We chose these sounds because, well, they sounded cool, and also because they're different enough that they would be distinguishable in the room. And then we wanted to apply a kind of geometry to each of the sounds. So we thought of kind of the rhythmic profile as one side, the melodic profile as another side, the timbral profile as a side. And then from here, we wanted to create ways in which they would assemble. So first I'll play you some of these sounds here. So the first one, the static buzz, is this guy.
And as you're listening to these, you might also notice that, it's interesting maybe to think about the fact that naming these sounds was one of the more challenging parts of this project. Naming them in a way that they would maybe be identifiable by the name plus what the sound was. It was an interesting exercise that I think we hadn't anticipated being as challenging as it was, but we'll see what you think about.
So the distorted footstep sounds. And then the warm chords, the dense chords sound. The plucks. Next up is the jangling glass and bells. And then the next sound is the reedy tone. So this is actually a recording of the Golden Gate Bridge foghorn from the 70s or something. And I found it online. It was a really old, crummy tape recorder. So I had to strip out a lot of the static sound. So I always refer to this sound as the foghorn, which
it sounds
Emily
nothing like a
always gives me,
foghorn anymore.
Yeah, hard time for. Hello.
You'll notice that there are 6 sounds and only 4 podiums. That's because 2 of the sounds, the reedy tone and the static buzz, are just sort of wandering unmanned through the room for a variety of practical and other reasons.
Okay, so we had the sounds, and then we started associating these geometries to them, or these sides of the sound, rather than thinking of them as kind of a linear process. Then we needed the energy force, so the interactive component. And I'm going to kind of zoom around one of those with the iPad here to show you what's inside.
And I'd like to extend many, many thanks to the folks here at the Exploratorium for helping us figure out how to make these things as stable and hardy and reasonable and unbreakable as possible.
Yeah, your guys' job isn't easy.
Yes, we knew it was going to be a challenge, but
Those kids can break anything. It's
they really
amazing.
can. They're very creative.
So, you want to switch over, Andy? All right. Okay. So we start, as you see here, basically it's just the sphere that you interact with. So this is actually a 3D printed sphere, and its geometry is very specific. It has this lip on the back, which is, the ellipse shape is actually shaped like the loudspeaker array. So you can't actually move the sphere where there aren't loudspeakers. It's constrained by this little platform here. So inside the sphere itself, which I think we can just barely see because they're tucked in there pretty good, is a motion sensor. So it's a 9 degree of freedom combined compass, accelerometer, and gyroscope to give you absolute spherical coordinate position. And then this is a little commutator here. Nothing too special about it, but it makes it so that the thing can actually spin around forever and not break. Then we go back into the PCB here, which is, has a couple different circuits, some that are useful and some that are no longer in operation. Originally we had a vibration circuit in there that would give you some tactile feedback when your sound started interacting, but didn't quite work out. So it all goes back to this Arduino here, which is the microprocessor, which sends the data up to the computer and processes everything into a specific syntax. The LEDs, which I'll explain in a second. And this is the wireless transmitter. So all the data gets transmitted wirelessly back up to the control room. All right. Okay. So now we have our sounds, we have our components with their geometries, and we have our, assembling force. But the next thing we needed to do was create the kind of means of assembly.
Mm-hmm. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that we knew which sounds we were using. We designed those to be sort of individual, but sort of characteristic of the same thing. They made sense together, but they all had their individual characteristics. And we knew what our 4 sort of ways of interacting would be: harmonic, melodic, cross-synthesized, which is sort of a timbral interaction, and rhythmic. But we didn't design the sounds to have very specific characteristics. What we did was we took the sounds that we had decided on and then just examined them, analyzed them, listened to them, and figured out what they did well and what sorts of shapes they might make with one another. So I actually spent a good amount of time with each of those sounds with pen and paper at my piano, listening and transcribing what the pitch content of the foghorns was, what the pitch content of the plucks was, what the rhythms of those footsteps could be, and trying to figure out what they were. You can see there's mine and there's Shane's. So I transcribed all the things that we had designed together, and then started looking at ways in which they had things in common, different sounds that it was always nice to find that maybe 2 of the sounds were using a lot of the same pitches, but there was maybe one pitch that neither of them had. So that would be an interesting pitch to concentrate on when we composed an interaction, this sort of blank spot that both of them create. So there were all sorts of ways that we looked at this.
Yeah, and this slide is basically to say, as Emily was saying, that this is kind of where Emily's coming from, and then the right side is where I'm coming from. More of an electronic music analysis background. I also kind of work in technical audio, so I get too geeky sometimes. But that said, we don't necessarily divide it exactly into Emily writes the notes and I make the sounds. There's definitely a collaborative process with both things. So the first thing to do was create the what we call the first order interactions, so 2 sounds interacting together. We decided that we have the interfaces here where you can move the sounds around. We decided that the way that the things would interact is when they arrive in the same space. So when you move a sound and it crosses paths with another sound, if the 2 sounds have one of these composed interactions, they'll fuse together and they'll create this new interaction. So basically, we were kind of thinking of doing some sort of algorithmic process to define how these sounds would interact based on, some sort of analysis of their timbre or something like that. We actually found it much more interesting just to listen through to all the things and decide which ones worked best harmonically, melodically, timbrally, and rhythmically. Play a few examples of what I mean by these different interactions. So we'll start with harmonic. This is the plucks and the
reedy tone.
Oh yeah, the plucks and the reedy tone. So first two there on the harmonic interaction.
So what I did here was I found the pitches that existed in one, the pitches that existed in the other, and then which pitches they had in common, and then passed the chord back and forth between the two timbres. But now the plucks are sustained. There's no melodic content, there's no rhythmic content to it, it's just sustained pitches.
So then the next one will be a melodic interaction. This is which one is this? The EBO. Yeah, this is the plucks again with the static buzz. So the red line that goes all the way down there.
And for this one, we found a little melodic chunk and then created a bass line with the static buzz that there could be some counterpoint between the two.
So cross-synthesis is a cool kind of computer music technique where you take one sound and you essentially, you combine the sounds in a way that's not just an amplitude combination. One sound will take on the spectral characteristics of the other sound, so they create this new, very different beast. So the cross-synthesized sounds I'm going to play are the bells and the warm chords. Oh, just kidding. You can still hear kind of small elements in each, but they're creating some totally new texture. And then we have a rhythmic combination. This is the reedy tone and the footsteps. So now, after the kind of first order, we have, 3 rhythmic ones, 3 cross-synthesized ones, 3 melodic ones, and 3 harmonic ones. So a good collection of sounds.
Any combinations that you don't see up here, we listened for them and thought, don't know that there's any way we can make that interesting enough to want to include it in our piece. So
basically
we left it out.
Elimination stage at each point. Mm-hmm. So then, basically just to make it easier on ourselves and minimize the confusion, we just assigned a letter to each of those and then thought about how they would build to the next level of structure. So the next level of structure we decided would be a 4-part or third order interaction. So basically if you have the plucks and the static buzz interacting on a melodic scale or a melodic means, and then either the dense chords or the glass and bells wander into that same space, they'll fuse together in this new 4-part interaction. So I can play one of those.
This is, I believe, A and K that he's going to play.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is A. Oh, that's the one I just described.
Yep. These interactions tend to be a little bit longer as a sort of way of getting more of the information about the different structures included separated. You can still hear elements of both A and K, but some of them get a little bit obscured or changed so that they fit together.
So the kind of rules for this stage was that no sound could happen more than once, and no first order interaction type could happen more than once. That constrained a lot of the possibilities down. Mm-hmm. Because as you can imagine, with 6 sounds and 4 different ways to interact, if we did every single one, I don't think
we
still
never
wouldn't be
have
done.
put it up.
So when those happen, they'll fuse in space. So you can't move the sounds when they're interacting with another sound and when the LEDs are lit. So if that was happening, 4 of the sounds would be stuck off in one space, and the other 2 would be available to move around. As the complexity of the sounds builds up and the complexity of the structure builds up, the space actually closes into one location.
It becomes much more localized.
And then lastly, we had these 3 means, or these kind of 3 ways that the sounds could assemble into a full 6-part structure. And we went back to the rhythmic, melodic, and harmonic elements. We decided to eliminate the cross-synthesis one because it was a little too, just anything. At this point, when you have 6 sounds together, you could kind of define anything as that. So I will play you one of those. And in the end, this is actually the only one we chose. We decided that there were, we started with the 3, and after we worked through all 3 elements, we decided that we would only go with the rhythmic interaction. So
that was partially because it was the strongest one, but also because what we were finding was that it was so difficult for people to get these interactions to happen that there was a good possibility that they would just never even show up in the piece. So
yeah, I haven't heard this very many times in space.
No.
So here it is. So that will happen, if you can assemble the sounds with all 6 parts working together, that will happen for 45 seconds, and then they'll all scatter again and
you'll
go
be back with
to
the
their
original
initial
bed
state.
of sounds.
So there's no right form of the piece. It's not necessarily that you get to the 6-part interaction and you've won and you've heard the piece in its best form. The idea behind the piece is that it should be as good in any state as in any other state. Because when the 6 sounds are all apart, they're all in different spaces in the room, and you're using the most of the space. It's a bit chaotic, but some people like chaos. But it should be as compelling in each state as any other. So, oops.
One of the other things we've been excited about with this particular form and this opportunity to work in this space is that the piece is pretty completely non-repeating, non-linear. You can come back in and experience it in a completely different way every single time. And you may hear the same things again, but you may hear completely different versions of the piece. And even if you do hear the same elements coming back, they won't be in the same order, they won't be happening at the same frequency. And so it's been really exciting to see how having people come in and use it, their personalities, what they do when they step into it, is actually a huge element of what the composition sounds like, which has been very, very exciting to experience.
So thanks for listening. Thanks for coming.
Yeah, and thank
thanks
you for hosting
to
us.
Nicole and Wayne and Andy and Jeffrey for all their help. And I should thank my company too. Yeah.
Yeah, we're here.
Yeah, we're here. You can turn it back on, Andy. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.